be in combination with China, then you have to ask what is the real future Russian-Chinese cooperation and on what terms?
Yes.
Hi. James Carroll was the only panelist who talked about nuclear arms reduction, and I'd be really interested to hear what other panelists have to say about that idea.
In direct connection to the new Cold War, Ukraine, what's the context of your?
Well, he's just saying, to repeat what he said, that we need to focus on reducing the number of nuclear arms in the world, and nobody else has talked about that. I'm curious what the reaction is. It doesn't work.
I'll take the invitation to say that I think we have far more nuclear weapons in the world than we need. I think that the security or the custodial arrangements around nuclear materials and nuclear weapons is inadequate in a number of places, including here in the United States. And so improving that security would be very, very helpful. I, however, would probably not go as far as James in how low I would go, because there are risks in actually going to zero as well. And how, when you have a world that is a non-nuclear world, then the breakout problem actually becomes significant. So I think we've got, overkill to boot, but going to zero and recreating a non-nuclear world, I think may be a bridge too far.
I do think...
Sorry. Could I ask a question of James? I want to be sure. Probably didn't hear you right. Did you say that President Obama has countenanced a much harder line on nuclear weapons reduction, and as part of foreign policy has stopped the process? Is that what you said? I'm not going to be critical if that's...
No, I'm saying that President Obama has been at the mercy of, starting out with a serious agenda to first come to terms with Russia to continue arms reduction to significant numbers. Obama's on the record as having wanted to go to hundreds of weapons, including the disposal of stored and unarmed weapons. So moving from the plus 10,000 level to the total between Russia and the United States of the counting weapons in the hundreds. That's Obama's starting wish. His first step toward that wish was the New START Treaty, so-called, in 2010. He was aggressive in pursuing it with Russia to get an agreement to go much lower than the START Treaty had taken us. And he hit a wall in the Republican-dominated Senate in what they required in return for the approval of that treaty. That treaty was approved. The level approved is 1,600 weapons without any attention to the stored and untargeted weapons, which are the elephant in the room, frankly. But since then, of course, it was in that period that Putin began his belligerence. And since then, the politics have made it impossible for Obama to pursue this. Now, my own view is that Obama, what is at risk now is not just further reductions, but the end of the idea, which has animated East and West policymakers for 60 years, the end of the idea that nuclear weapons are not necessarily a permanent part of the world arsenal. And that's what's underway right now, is what I'm asserting, that the permanence of nuclear weapons comes with the reinvention and the modernization, so-called, of nuclear weapons. For me, the point isn't particularly to fault Barack Obama. It's, as is true of so many of the things he's attempted, the politics have been impossible for him. Although my own view is that once he leaves office as president, he will become, yet again, a global advocate for the idea of nuclear disarmament, but it will be as a man out of power. And in the next 2 years, he could actually take steps unilaterally. He could order unilateral reductions. That would be a political brouhaha, because even the elimination of nuclear weapons is expensive, requiring budget approvals that he would be hard put to get. But nevertheless, he could order unilateral reductions in the American arsenal as a challenge to Russia. and as a signal to non-nuclear weapon states that the ideal of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is not dead. That's what's at risk here. Why doesn't Saudi Arabia have a nuclear weapon? Why doesn't Brazil have a nuclear weapon? Why doesn't Australia have a nuclear weapon? It's because of this fragile bargain that was made, which is now being savagely undercut by the modernization programs that Obama, forced by the Republicans, is now sponsoring. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Yes.
I want to touch a topic that your panel have not talked about. I thought that the climate change push for fossil fuel, stop using fossil fuel in the future, make fossil fuel as a resource irrelevant. So is that part of creating enemies so they can still continue using fossil fuel and defense complex, all the industrial complex? That's my question. And then it debates with Jim Carroll's view that economics is relevant. It is relevant.
Anybody like to comment?
Well, that's a tough question. They're great questions. How does the move toward alternative energy sources and away from fossil fuels as a base, how is it affected by a 50-some-odd barrel of oil reduction that might be
Well, that's
permanent?
driving alternative energy out.
Well,
The
probably
reduction
not
price.
totally, but I think it's very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell. You know, the entrenched cost of the development of these alternative sources of energy and the savings and efficiencies in business and otherwise, and the way we use them in our lives, it's kind of hard to totally, stop that. But the economics of $50 versus 110 is going to change behavior, and it is an off-the-wall event. When's the last time we had a 50% decline in the price of oil? So what we should have is, over a long period of time on economics, you should have economies growing more, the demand for oil and energy picking up, and you should have on the supply side a reduction in supply initially, and then demand will overtake supply and prices will go up. But gee, that could take, who knows? And there's so much in between. You know, Milton Friedman, when oil prices went up this opposite direction, quadrupled in the 1970s, I have analyzed probably 10 or 15 oil price events, up and down. We had a down in the 90s, and that was great because it cut the rate of inflation and it cut the rate of unemployment. And it had something to do with the demise of the natural rate as we knew it then, because the unemployment went a lot lower. That was an external shock that was very, very positive. But the one in 73, 75 was a quadrupling of oil prices, and Milton Friedman said, and it's correct on comparative statics basis, that the oil price is going to come down. He was right, but it took 20-some-odd years for that to happen. So it's the path of what goes on in between and everything that is in the way of the path. So it's impossible. Tesla, I don't think they're out of business, just because we have a change down $50. And all of the stuff that's in train will continue, but there will be major impacts on behavior. I don't think it totally shuts off the...
Could I just make a comment, if you're finished? I mean, I was very struck by the fact that we're very, very willing to spend large proportions of GDP on defense, but not on effective policies to prevent climate change. I mean, the Stern report estimates that, you know, if we were to take effective steps to prevent global warming, it would and apply the proper discounting rule, our GDPs might be 1% to 2% smaller by 2050 than they would be otherwise. And I noted that Charles Knight said that over the period of Cold War, we spent about 1% to 2% of GDP on our military expenditure. You know, we're prepared to spend huge amounts of money on largely imaginary threats and no money at all on real threats.
I would just, if you don't, I would just like to reinforce that. What a diversion from what really should be on our agendas to start a new Cold War. Really, really a historic mistake.
Yes.
Yes, I'm a 1956 refugee from Hungary, and I went back in 1990 to Hungary, and communists fell. I'm nervous when I'm hearing that we have to respect the strategic interests of Russia. And at one point, my country, along with Central and Eastern Europe, were the strategic interests of Russia. I am very nervous when I am hearing that NATO expansion to Central and Eastern Europe was the wrong fork. Because Russia now said the strategic investment is Crimea, and run it over. If there were no NATO, my country would have become again strategic interest and maybe run over along with Central and Eastern Europe. Central and Eastern Europe has an entirely different view of NATO and the Russian threat than you gentlemen seem to see. Because these countries were not only subjected to Russian rule, but also to a crazy ideology, which was communism. And if communists fell in Central and Eastern Europe, it's not because there was a war. Cold War was a comfortable thing for the West, for the US, and the rest, because it was stability. They forgot the 100 million people that were on the other side. Cold War was because the local people stood up against dictatorship. Berlin, Budapest, Prague, Poland. How did it happen? Because Russia was unable to compete in the arms race. Reagan was the hero of that in our view. And then as soon as the people of Central and Eastern Europe felt that there was a weakness on the side of the Russia, they stood up. And you know, in 1988, 1989, etc. came. So that's history. So I think we are in a hostile world. Maybe 100, 150 years from now, everybody would be on the same side. Right now, we have different powers, we have a different side, and my experience is also there. Thank you.
If I could, I do depart from my colleagues on that particular issue. The history of the world supports your view. You come from a country that was particularly injured and then moved to freedom, and there's a huge difference. And so when I try to figure out what motivates Vladimir Putin, it's a sense for him of Russian history and the power that Russia once had, and he said this very, very clearly, he'd like to restore that power. And on foreign policy, and I'm an amateur, follow this, it affects markets and economies. History teaches us, the empirical evidence is clear, that it may not be a mistake to be tough on NATO and to have condoned some expansion of NATO and inclusion of other countries into NATO. When you have someone running a country who's unpredictable and where the country has a history. My father fled from Poland in 1915 as the Russians overran Poland. So the history of Russia and its expansionist ambitions is very clear. So I think we start from there, and that's how we should handle a situation. So I am not very concerned about the mistakes or the turn in the road as a carrot for Russia to agree with the U.S. and not engage in further expansionist ambitions. In fact, I think they would do it no matter what.
If I might add a footnote from my own narrow perspective, the decision, as several panelists have pointed out, to expand NATO in the early Clinton years was accompanied by another decision that's relevant to the argument I'm making. Bill Clinton came into office as a nuclear reducer. He was picking up the baton that had been left by Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Between the two of them, the American nuclear arsenal had been halved. And that was the context within which Bill Clinton commissioned, as he is required to do, the Nuclear Posture Review as one of his first acts as president. The Nuclear Posture Review, and Charles is more of an expert on this than I am, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall it, the Nuclear Posture Review of 1994, presided over by a nuclear dove, Les Aspin, who was a congressman, had made arms control central to his concerns. So arms reduction was the moving thrust. And the Nuclear Posture Review of 1994, a kind of echo of NATO expansion from the Pentagon, argued for keeping the nuclear arsenal at present levels as a, quote, hedge, unquote, against the possibility that reforms in Russia would be stillborn. And in effect, and Clinton accepted that Nuclear Posture Review, and it put on the back burner, if not off the stove completely, the impulse toward aggressive nuclear reduction. And so there was a way. This is all part of the don't ask, don't tell syndrome. Bill Clinton yielding to military experts and their recommendations in that crucial period of his first 2 years as president, when so many of the initiatives that he arrived with were stymied, not only by Republicans, but by national security establishment people who were determined not to lose the central power in American government that the Cold War had given them. And the fork in the road in NATO has an echo in the fork in the road in nuclear arms reduction, which was stalled, tragically stalled, in Bill Clinton's first term.
I think that I understand very much where, the feeling behind the question and the arguments behind it. But I don't think anyone on the panel was criticized Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others becoming part of NATO. I mean, the Russian satellites, of course, they got their independence, and they chose to be part of that alliance. I think a better solution, even now, would have been the attempt to construct a new collective security system covering the whole of Europe and including the United States. I think that would have been better, but nevertheless, I'm in no way criticizing the expansion of NATO thus far. But when it comes to saying, okay, Ukraine must not be debarred from joining NATO, or Georgia, I mean, that is impinging much closer on the area of historic Russian interest. And that's what makes me nervous.
Yes. Yes, a question for the panelists. We talked about China, the U.S., Russia relationship, Europe. My question is the Islamic radicalism. One elephant in the room we haven't talked about. This combination, sort of tail risk events of precipitous drop in the price of oil, the Ukrainian crisis that is creating an antagonistic relationship between the United States and Russia. How does that play in terms of stability, risks to stability in the Middle East?
That's really an entirely different panel. But it's obviously a huge question. I'll say this would be an issue where, in fact, Russian and American interests are mostly aligned, given Russian concerns about Islamic radicalism in places like Chechnya, where they've had significant problems in the past and haven't handled them particularly well. Certainly, their interests are more closely aligned on that particular issues than they are with us on some other. The second thing I think we see is that there is, for lack of a better word, something of I think a generational struggle call it an internal civil war happening within the Arab and Islamic world over what trajectory those different societies are going to take, what the territorial divisions are going to be now, which are hard to forecast, say in places like Syria or Iraq, where the lines are drawn now are going to be the same lines 25 or 30 years hence. My own view is that the United States and Western Europe are not going to be the referees of this particular quarrel. We're not going to determine who the winners and losers are. Our capacity to do that in the past has not been high. I think one of the things we're learning is the only thing worse than a really, really bad state is no state, right, or a failed state. And therefore, because we don't have a reliable capacity to dictate the internal politics of places like Syria or Libya or Iraq or elsewhere, for us to try and sort of play kingmaker or determine who's going to win the outcome of that internal set of discussions would be a mistake and would probably make it worse, because opposition to what is regarded as foreign interference has been part of the fuel that's been driving some of the extremist movements as well. But again, that's sort of an entirely different set of topics than the one we've been talking about here.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. If not,
Quick comment. Hungary, I know, has gone, President of Hungary has been rebelling against the EU, isn't that correct?
Let me address this issue. Hungary depends on 85% on gas. So there's no other way that you can import. But if you listen to this and Hungarians listen to that, oh, can we count on the West? And then they start to look to find for their survival something. So this is where I see it's very, very dangerous. Why is the Czech Republic, Zeman also saying? Zeman is saying we cannot count on the West. So we were run, the Czechs said, we were run over by Russia. Okay, but there is a danger that it might again happen. So if you feel that there is a weakness on the side that where you think you will be defended, if there is a weakness, then countries that are in between the two, they begin to think, what can I do? And that's the danger, I think, to show weakness on the part of the West.
okay, with that, I want to thank my panel, I want to thank the audience.